Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Our Crisis Media Center continues its work, and the topic is de-Sovietization possible without decentralization amendments to the Constitution. Yaryna Zhurba, Executive Director of the Analyst platform, November 21st, Coordinator of UCMC, Project Government Communications Reform in Ukraine. Please take the floor. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'm going to speak about decentralization. This is a broad process, and we may speak about it from different perspectives. And today we are going to speak about decentralization and de-Sovietization and whether these two processes are interrelated. And we will start with the focal change that is envisaged by the law and the change into the law. And today, the Article 133 gives the information on the names of oblasts. These names of oblasts are regulated by the Constitution. Kirovograd is under the law on decommunization, and to rename the oblasts, we should introduce changes into the Constitution. And the law on the changes envisages such amendments and provisions on Article 133. This information will be ousted from this article. Due to this change, we may rename settlements and towns, and in this way we will complete the law on the decommunization. But this is an illustration of the process of de-Sovietization. And I would like to tell you about de-Sovietization in a broader sense, about changes that will be in the result of introduction of amendments to the Constitution. There are many aspects of this process, and the first one is civilizational choice. We speak a lot about decentralization is the practical realization of this civilizational choice. Because we have a structure of power of a repressive character. It was provided by the Soviet occupation, before by Russian occupation, and it is not natural for Ukraine. We are a European state, and by decentralizing power, we return to that structure that was appropriate for us before that historic period. And the example that we are really a sovereign state is the historic fact that we had courts of community. So they organized a court by themselves. They didn't expect some orders from a sovereign. The order was provided by a community, and they could provide justice. And in our genetic memory, we have this approach. This is a European approach, and Magdeburg right is also a part of it. And decentralization is a civilizational approach. We get rid of this hierarchic structure, and decentralization leads to de-Sovietization. We overcome monopolies, and this is experience of Poland. and in retrospective, they say that reform and self-governance is one of the key aspects that help to say goodbye to Soviet past. And they overcome monopolies, political monopolies, and introduction of free and fair elections. And a second aspect is overcoming of monopolies when state and regional levels are subordinated to the top authority, but that everything is the law is on top of everything, and this is the main factor for decommunization in Poland. And other aspect is overcoming financial monopoly when where local budgets are independent of the state budget, and now the step is made by Ukraine. And last year, 1 year ago, some changes were introduced in the budget and tax codes, and they increased the budget, and these budgets are regulated autonomously, and local budgets shouldn't wait shouldn't wait for the state budget to be formed. So every local budget can be formed by councils. And this is a step to overcome financial monopoly, and Ukraine in some part did this. All these aspects now the power is not concentrated in one hand, and this is means of effectiveness. But also dignity and freedom are important. In a centralized and repressive state, dignity and freedom of person, they are under threat. And if we have a sovereign, there are risks that the power will do whatever it wants, and we all know about this recent experience. Decentralized state is more safe for an individual. An individual feels more safe in such a state. And all these aspects, they lead to some extent to de-sovietisation of Ukraine. And we are speaking not only about names, but the whole structure. The main aim is to overcome this hierarchical structure of the state. And as a conclusion, as a consequence of this, it should be some kind of variety. Centralized state provides everything at the same level. So to each city or villages, the approach is the same, speaking about management, but the potential of each community is different. And decentralization helps to see the potential of each community, and it provides the means for a variety in the sphere. And it is not only about community, but also about individuals, because the system we want to get rid of, so to de-sovietize, this system, when we decentralize the system, it cultivates leadership and initiative, and not only cultivate, but even demands this. And the success of decentralization depends on whether we find people who will be responsible for this and who will seek opportunities. and this institution, global institution, we see now it will disappear, and we should not wait for something. We should use new opportunities. And maybe one more aspect of decentralization is building horizontal connections and relationship, and this communication now goes always through the capital, through Kiev, and if we want to establish some sort of communication at the regional level, this communication goes through Kiev. But now we have a law on the communication among the communities. And if there's an issue that a community cannot resolve, for example, in Poland, the utilization of waste is a responsibility of the community, and one community is not able to do this. So several communities they have an agreement among themselves that they will cooperate and that they provide some financing for this, and also we have this instrument for cooperation among communities. If a community don't have enough resources to deal with the problem, so two communities can agree on some things, and this is horizontal cooperation that leads to effectiveness when we don't wait when the center deal with this issue. So they see resources, they see people at the local level and the potential, they get together, and these resources and people, they are gathered and the issue is resolved. So these aspects of de-sovietisation and decommunization in such a way, these things are resolved. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your opinion about those two major things which have to intersect or intertwine and lead to a new quality, both if you're talking about the management or bringing about the changes and transformations in the everyday life of ordinary people. I have a following question. Since you are an expert in improving the communication in the central bodies with the power, what do you think? What actions should be carried out by the authorities in order, we are talking about the implementation of legislation regarding the unification of different communities, how to improve the situation or the perception by the local citizens, because there are different points of view. And there are two different models, either to say that we have a law and force everyone to do that, or maybe there are some other actions or measures to be taken in order for such campaign of this Sovietization be efficient and not provoking people some kind of internal resistance or inner resistance. Thank you for your question. This is really a very complex process, and I believe here the major opponent to this Sovietization is just ordinary habit, I would say, and the resistance which you can see in some of the localities regarding, for example, renaming some of the things, and people often say that this name should be preserved. They were born when those titles and names existed. No, for example, many people in Dnipropetrovsk who do not know that we are talking about a person who was involved in some of the tragedies in Ukraine, Holodomor, for example, famine, etc. For example, perhaps they should be asked whether you are happy with the fact that your city in its name bears the name of a person who was involved in the famine in Ukraine, who killed a lot of persons. So what kind of the answer would you have, or response would you have in this case? So I believe that this kind of discussion should be switch over to some of the plane of values, because some kind of discomfort which the people will have to live through associated with renaming. You have to do some work in order to for all the people to get accustomed to a new name. This is, not a big price for the values for which we actually started this process. Somebody aptly said that hardly the let's say the children of those people who live today in Lugansk and Donetsk region, if the streets will be remain, they carry the names of the terrorists and the separators. Just to revive the historical memory, this is our debt before our ancestors and our next generations, because, for example, I don't know whether people can feel himself or herself real free being living on the street of Lenin, for example. So mostly we are talking about the value-related choice. This is one aspect. Aspect number two, for example, Dnipropetrovsk, many people call this city just Dnipro or Dnieper. This is more natural name, and we shouldn't look for some other options for naming some of the settlement populated areas. Name them give them some names which are not really have nothing to do with this location or this city. We have to create some prerequisites for renaming different localities. Yaryna, I have the following question to you. Do you believe the draft law on introducing changes, the amendments into constitutions, flawless, or do you think that Verkhovna Rada has to elaborate on that? Thank you for your question. With your permission, I'm going to divide your question into parts. Whether I believe it an ideal one, or should the Verkhovna Rada support this draft law? No, I do not believe it's an ideal or flawless draft law, and not something which has to be adopted or approved from Rada. It has some of the drawbacks. The name of prefects, we just mentioned that names must be something familiar to people. Perfect is not a Ukrainian name. I don't know why this name is used in the constitution. Must be some different name for that. Something which people understand and they're used to. And another thing which is more meaningful, for example, that at the same time we have the failure of introducing those changes to strengthen the local communities and local self-governance. So the local councils will have the powers of the executive committees. The general idea is correct, but the regional self-governance must be more potentiality than the local governance. Local governance, in its turn, will gravitate to avoid responsibility in this case. And under such a situation, we face certain risks that the regional self-governance will take more powers and authorities which should be given to that. How to avoid such risks or to prevent such a risk? First, we have to introduce those amendments into constitutions which are aimed at strengthening the local communities, and maybe in 80 years from now to introduce executive committees in the regional councils. Though the executive committees in the district councils must be introduced now. This will minimize the risks, in my opinion, and will strengthen the local governance. But the problem is that even in the discourse of this dispute, whether everything should be done simultaneously or to be divided in some phases or stages. They even do not talk about that. On the contrary, they come up with some destructive myths, untruthful myths, which and very often in the society they discuss some kind of the bubbles, not real things, which are aimed at creating some kind of terrible and untrue stories, etc. Now I'm coming to the next point in your question, whether it should be approved by the parliament. Actually, the process was not constructive. We are talking about some kind of movement towards some populism and political struggle. If it were a civilized process, now the Verkhovna Rada had to work on those, let's say, minor target-oriented things in the process. And this is boiled down to the fact that we either support or adopt this draft law or decline it. And if we have this choice either to adopt or to decline this draft law, so the obvious question is we have to adopt this draft law because despite those some minor things, this draft law is a big step forward and actually makes this reform, enables this reform to move ahead. And if we fail to do this now, this will mean continuation of stagnation. Thank you, Yaryna. And perhaps the last question for today. I have the following questions. There are different experts who have a different evaluation of the possibility of implementation of this reform, depending on whether the amendments to the constitution will be adopted or not. And they say that if we do not fail to adopt the amendment to the constitution, that it's not that a big deal because most of the reforms will be implemented. We are talking about this different levels of communities. So, do you think the de-sovietisation, the regionalization, the public control of the country, or management of the country will take place? What kind of experts you support? Is this a matter of principle to make amendments into the constitution, etc., etc.? Yes, indeed, there are some ideas that to introduce decentralization without the amendments in the constitution, but this is a plan B. So they were taking care of those if they failed to even introduce amendments into the constitution. But decentralization without amendments to the constitution will be not complete procedure. This is something which you mentioned today. The constitution doesn't make provision for the exec committees in the regional and district councils. We have to delegate the authorities of the central bodies to the executive committees. It's impossible to do that without amendments in the constitution. Either we say that the district administration do exist, but we try to take some of their authorities. We are going to have kind of semi-working model, semi-operational model. Today we need to have some systematic changes because this reform very much depends on the preparedness or readiness of the people themselves. So we do not have the critical mass of those people who are going to support this reform. And if this reform is not real perfect, the mechanism, kind of self-implementing mechanism, we shouldn't expect some big results out of that. As for the de-Sovietization, you were talking about that broad aspect we mentioned. If we do not have the full-scale reform implementation, I mean, we won't be able to create some kind of self-governance, etc., etc. But even in the first part, we start with renaming of these populated areas, cities, villages, etc., etc., streets. Can you imagine this situation when smaller towns and for example, are going to be renamed, but Dnipropetrovsk and Kirovograd will preserve their names. Will this mean the complete process of renaming? No. So maybe we could ask a question. Maybe we can have a separate law to rename only those two big cities. But first of all, this will not mean the implementation of the de-sovietisation, the communization law, because the process of making or introducing amendments to the constitution is a lengthy one. So Verkhovna Rada has only 3 months' time. They have to implement the law on renaming of the populated areas, and if we introduce today some kind of draft law introducing amendments into the constitution, then the Verkhovna Rada will not fit in this period of time. But this is not a matter of principle. The matter of principle is the fact that we have to kind of wholesome reform. We should not fragment that into some kind of parts because of the fear, because they created some myths. We have to unveil those myths and to say that what can give the people the vision, what is going to happen after the reform is implemented, and to demonstrate the different opportunities. So we have to channel this discourse from the fears of discussion on opportunities. Then the question of introducing amendments to the constitution will just be removed away. And thank you, Yaryna. This is the end of our press conference. Thank you for coming, and see you again. May I remind you, the next briefing of Colonel Alexander Martuzanik will take place in several minutes.